In 1911, on a road in Wayne County, Michigan, Edward N. Hines saw something so ordinary that most men would have ignored it. A milk wagon had passed ahead of him, leaking a pale white trail across the dark surface of the road. To a tired driver, it was just spilled milk. But to Hines, a road commissioner living in the shadow of Detroit's exploding automobile age, that thin white stain looked like something America desperately needed. A line between life and death. At that moment, the United States was becoming a nation on wheels faster than anyone knew how to control. The Ford Model T had arrived only a few years earlier, and by the time Ford's moving assembly line began running at Highland Park, cars were no longer toys for the rich. A machine that once seemed rare was suddenly appearing in towns, farms, factory districts, church roads, and city intersections. But the roads themselves still belonged to an older world of horses, wagons, mud, dust, brick, and blind curves. There were no familiar yellow center lines guiding drivers through two-way traffic. There were no dashed lane markings quietly telling a man when it was safe to pass. On many roads, the only rule was to honk loudly, keep your eyes open, and pray the driver coming around the bend was not aiming for the same strip of dry ground. In wet weather, people fought for the raised crown in the middle of the road to avoid the mud, which meant the safest part of the road could suddenly become the deadliest. By 1918, more than 10,000 people were dying each year in motor vehicle crashes across the United States. That was not because Americans were foolish, but because the machine had arrived before the language needed to control it. A driver could buy a car, cross a county, race past a farm, and meet a truck head-on without a single painted warning between them. And the terrifying truth is this: before America learned to paint order onto the road, every ordinary Sunday drive carried the hidden danger of becoming a funeral procession. But the strangest part of this story is not that a white line helped save lives. The strangest part is that America needed years of crashes, arguments, ignored warnings, and roadside terror before something this simple became obvious. A doctor in California would later be forced off the road by a massive truck and decide to fight the same battle with her own hands. And when she painted her line, she exposed a question far more disturbing than anyone expected. How many Americans had already died because the country could build cars faster than it could build common sense? The real danger was never just the absence of paint. It was that America had unleashed a new kind of speed onto an old kind of road. In the early 20th century, many rural roads were still dirt, gravel, clay, brick, or rough stone, shaped more by weather and wagon wheels than by engineers. A family could leave town in a Ford Model T, and within a few miles, find themselves driving on a surface built for horses. In 1904, only about 1/6 of rural public roads in the United States had any kind of improved surface. That meant most roads could change character with the season, the rain, or even a single heavy wagon passing through. In dry weather, dust could rise so thick that an approaching car looked like a ghost inside a brown cloud. In wet weather, the same road could become a ribbon of mud, forcing drivers toward the raised center, where everyone else also wanted to be. That raised center became one of the quiet dangers of early American driving. On old country roads, the middle was often the firmest, driest, and smoothest place to travel. But when two automobiles came toward each other, both drivers might believe they had the right to hold that same narrow strip. Without a painted line, the road did not clearly say who belonged where. In cities like Detroit and Chicago, the problem looked different but felt just as dangerous. Streets carried horses, streetcars, wagons, bicycles, pedestrians, delivery carts, and new automobiles all at once. A driver did not simply watch the road. He watched children crossing, horses panicking, factory workers stepping off curbs, and trucks cutting through traffic. The American street had become a crowded stage, but nobody had given the actors the same script. The Ford Model T made this confusion impossible to ignore. Between 1908 and 1927, more than 15 million Americans bought one, and for many families it was the first machine that could carry them beyond the limits of walking, horses, or train schedules. In many years, Ford produced more than half of all automobiles sold in the country. The car gave ordinary people freedom, but it also placed ordinary people inside a moving steel machine before the road had learned how to guide them. Speed changed the meaning of every mistake. A wagon driver could often see trouble coming and pull aside slowly. A motorist could come around a blind curve, meet another vehicle head-on, and have only seconds to choose between a ditch, a fence, a tree, or a crash. The horn became a warning, a threat, and sometimes the only traffic signal a driver had. By 1911, the United States recorded more than 2,000 deaths from motor vehicle crashes. By 1918, that number had climbed past 10,000 in a single year. These were not just numbers on a government table. They were families waiting at supper, doctors called too late, and newspapers printing the same kind of tragedy again and again. America was discovering that a road without order could turn progress into grief. And this is why the simple Centerline mattered so much. It did not make the engine stronger, the tires better, or the driver wiser. It gave the road a voice. For the first time, the pavement itself could tell Americans, this side is yours, and that side is not. Long before Americans argued over white paint and yellow paint, human beings had already discovered one uncomfortable truth about movement. The moment people, animals, carts, and goods share the same narrow path, the road becomes more than ground beneath the feet. It becomes a place where power, speed, fear, and habit collide. The center line was new to the automobile age, but the need behind it was ancient. Around 1600, on a road near Mexico City, one of the earliest known examples of road marking appeared in a form that did not require paint at all. Lighter colored stones were set into the pavement to create a center line, separating opposing movement on the road. Imagine the simplicity of that idea. Not a machine, not a law book, not a police officer, but stones arranged so travelers could read the road beneath them. It was an early sign that people were beginning to understand traffic as something that had to be organized before it became dangerous. Ancient cities faced the same problem in another form. In Pompeii, where carts, animals, merchants, residents, and pedestrians crowded the streets, raised stepping stones helped people cross without stepping directly into water, mud, and street filth. These stones were not modern lane markings, but they reveal the same instinct that later produced crosswalks and center lines. A street was not simply a strip of open space. It had to be divided so the weak were not crushed by the strong. The Romans understood roads as tools of control. Their great routes moved soldiers, tax collectors, messages, food, stone, and authority across enormous distances. A road could pull a distant province closer to Rome, shorten the march of a legion, or carry trade into a city market before the goods spoiled. But even with all that engineering genius, the ordinary traveler still depended heavily on custom, caution, and the behavior of strangers. For centuries after Rome, most roads were still ruled less by painted instructions than by human habit. A rider learned where to pass from local custom. A cart driver learned which side felt safer by watching other carts. A pilgrim, a merchant, and a farmer might all share the same road, but they did not always share the same rule. This is why the question of left and right became so important long before the automobile. In some places, travelers kept left. In others, they kept right. Some explanations point to mounted riders, sword hands, and the need to face a possible enemy on the road. Others point to wagons, horses, and drivers who needed a clear view when passing another vehicle. In America, the practical habits of wagon drivers helped shape the future rule of the road. The Federal Highway Administration notes that Pennsylvania's Philadelphia and Lancaster Turnpike Charter in 1792 provided for travel on the right-hand side. New York later prescribed right-hand travel on all public highways in 1804. By the time of the Civil War, the right side had become the American way. But choosing a side was not the same as marking the side. A law could tell drivers where they were supposed to be. But on a dark road, a muddy curve, or a dusty hill, the law was invisible. The ground did not speak. If a tired farmer, a nervous young driver, or a truck loaded with goods drifted toward the middle, there was often nothing on the road itself to correct him. That invisible rule became more dangerous as roads grew busier. In the 19th century, some markings appeared in isolated places, especially where danger concentrated, such as bridges or narrow approaches. A bridge forced travelers into a confined space, leaving less room for guessing and less mercy for mistakes. In those places, the old road finally began to show the first hints of the modern idea. Guidance had to be placed where the danger happened. By 1907, one account cited in a transportation study points to painted stop lines in Portsmouth, Virginia. By 1911, New York City was using markings for crosswalks. These early markings did not yet create the nationwide system Americans recognize today, but they proved that paint could carry authority. A mark on the pavement could tell a driver to stop, tell a pedestrian where to cross, and tell a city that order no longer had to live only on signs or in rule books. Still, America's deepest road problem remained unsolved. A stop line could control an intersection, and a crosswalk could protect a pedestrian, but the open road had a different danger. Out there, between farms, towns, hills, and factory cities, two vehicles could approach each other at rising speed with nothing but instinct between them. The old habits of horses and wagons were about to meet the new violence of engines, and the country would soon discover that custom alone could not hold back the automobile. The Centerline did not spread across America because drivers suddenly became careful. It spread because the road itself was becoming one of the most important machines in American life. By the early 20th century, a road was no longer just a path between a farm and a town. It was becoming a channel for mail, milk, groceries, doctors, factory goods, school children, churchgoers, and the growing dreams of families who wanted to travel farther than their parents ever had. The push for better roads had started before the automobile took over. In the 1880s and 1890s, bicycle riders were among the loudest voices, demanding smoother, safer roads. To them, mud and ruts were not just inconveniences, they were barriers to freedom. The Good Roads movement began as a campaign for mobility, but the automobile soon turned it into a national necessity. In 1893, the federal government created the Office of Road Inquiry inside the Department of Agriculture. That detail matters because roads were still seen as a rural problem before they were seen as an automobile problem. Farmers needed roads to move crops, families needed roads to reach markets, and local leaders needed practical advice on how to build surfaces that would survive weather and heavy use. Long before the Centerline became common, America was already learning that bad roads could trap people in place. Then came rural free delivery. On October 1st, 1896, mail delivery began in Charlestown, Halltown, and Uvilla, West Virginia, bringing regular postal service directly to rural homes. Within 1 year, 44 rural routes were operating in 29 states. For families who once had to travel miles to ask whether a letter had arrived, the road suddenly became a lifeline to newspapers, catalogs, family news, politics, and the outside world. But mail carriers quickly exposed the weakness of America's roads. A muddy road did not just slow a Sunday driver, it delayed information. A washed-out road did not just inconvenience a farmer, it separated a household from medicine, money orders, legal notices, and news. When the postman could not get through, the nation could feel how poor roads cut rural citizens away from modern life. The automobile made that pressure impossible to ignore. Between 1908 and 1927, more than 15 million Americans bought the Ford Model T. This was not merely a business success, it changed the geography of ordinary life. A farmer could reach a larger market, a doctor could cover more patients, and a family could visit relatives in a single day instead of planning around horses, trains, or weather. With every new car, the road carried more ambition and more danger. Gas stations, garages, tire shops, roadside diners, repairmen, and small businesses began to grow around the driver's needs. By 1930, 23 million cars were on American roads, and more than half of American families owned one. The road had become a marketplace, a workplace, and a social space all at once. This is where lane markings began to matter beyond safety alone. A painted center line helped turn a road from a local habit into a shared public system. It told the milk truck, the family car, the farm wagon, and the delivery driver that they were all participating in the same rule. That little line made strangers cooperate without speaking, without waving, and without knowing each other's names. Government also began to see roads differently. On July 11th, 1916, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Aid Road Act, the beginning of the Federal Aid Highway Program. The law focused on rural post roads, showing how closely transportation, communication, and national development had become connected. America was no longer asking whether roads mattered, it was asking who would pay to make them reliable. World War I slowed that effort because workers and materials were pulled toward the war. But even the war revealed the same lesson. A country that could not move people, mail, supplies, food, and vehicles efficiently was weaker than it looked on a map. Roads were no longer just local property. They were part of national strength. By the time centerlines began appearing in more places, they carried the weight of all these changes. They belonged to the farmer trying to reach town before rain ruined the road, the postal carrier trying to finish a route, the factory worker driving home after dark, and the mother watching a truck approach from the opposite direction. The line was thin, but the world behind it was enormous. It marked the moment when America's roads stopped being open ground and started becoming a language every driver was expected to understand. The dark side of the automobile did not appear all at once. It arrived in newspaper headlines, hospital wards, courthouse questions, and families who heard a knock at the door after someone failed to come home. On September 13, 1899, Henry H. Bliss stepped down from a streetcar at West 74th Street and Central Park West in New York City. A passing electric taxicab struck him, and by the next morning, America had a name attached to a new kind of death. That first recorded tragedy was not yet a national panic. It could still be treated as a strange accident from a strange machine. But once the automobile moved from curiosity to common possession, the danger multiplied faster than public understanding. The old street had been a shared place. The new street was becoming a battlefield between flesh, steel, wheels, and speed. Connecticut saw the danger early. On May 21, 1901, the state passed one of the first American laws regulating motor vehicles, limiting them to 12 miles per hour in cities and 15 miles per hour on country roads. Those speeds sound gentle today, almost harmless, but to a pedestrian stepping off a curb, a horse startled by an engine, or a wagon turning into traffic, they could feel like violence arriving without warning. The law also revealed how confused the transition had become. Drivers were expected to slow down or stop around horses because the animal world and the machine world still occupied the same road. A motorcar might be modern, but it was moving through towns built for footsteps, hoofbeats, and hand signals. America had invented a faster way to travel before it had fully decided what the road was for. By 1911, the United States recorded more than 2,000 motor vehicle deaths. By 1918, the number had passed 10,000 in a single year. By 1920, it had climbed beyond 12,000. These were not distant battlefield losses. They were deaths on neighborhood streets, rural roads, factory routes, market roads, and family trips. Every crash carried more than broken glass and bent metal. It carried blame. Was the driver reckless, or was the road too narrow? Was the pedestrian careless, or had the city surrendered too much space to machines? Was the child in the street at fault, or had adults allowed a new technology to enter daily life without building rules strong enough to protect the vulnerable? This battle over blame became one of the most important conflicts of the automobile age. In the early years, many Americans viewed the driver as the dangerous intruder. Streets had long belonged to many people at once. Children playing, shoppers walking, streetcars stopping, vendors working, and neighbors crossing wherever life required them to cross. The automobile did not just enter that world. It demanded that the world rearrange itself around the automobile. That is why the word jaywalker matters. In the early 1920s, according to historians of traffic culture, the term was promoted to shame pedestrians who cross streets outside approved places. It turned an ordinary street user into a figure of ridicule, someone backward, foolish, and out of place. Language became another traffic device, pushing people off the open street before paint, signs, and signals fully took command. The campaign was sometimes almost theatrical. At a New York safety event, a man dressed like a rural fool was mockingly bumped by a Model T again and again to make the jaywalker look ridiculous. The scene may sound comic, but beneath it was a serious transfer of power. The public was being taught that the street was no longer a shared civic space first. It was becoming a corridor for vehicles. Cities tried to answer with control. Stop lines, crosswalks, hand signals, traffic officers, and early traffic lights began to appear as desperate attempts to bring order to streets that had outgrown custom. In Cleveland, Garrett Morgan demonstrated a traffic signal that did more than alternate stop and go. His 1923 patent included a pause that stopped traffic in all directions, creating a safer interval for pedestrians caught in the machinery of the modern street. But even signals could not solve the open road. Outside the city, there might be a truck could come out of darkness, dust, rain, or a blind curve with nothing to separate its path from yours. The crisis was not simply that Americans were crashing. It was that they were crashing inside a system that had not yet learned how to warn them. This was the human cause behind the painted line. It was born from fear, grief. The same machine that carried a farmer to market could crush a pedestrian near a streetcar. The same road that promised independence could become a place where one bad guess ended a life. So the Centerline was never just a convenience. It was part of a larger moral decision. The road had to protect people from one another before speed turned every mistake into a tragedy. America did not paint lines because driving was simple. It painted them because driving had become too powerful to leave to instinct alone. By the time America reached the middle of the 20th century, the painted line was no longer just a local experiment. It had become part of a much larger transformation, one that moved the road from county habit into federal language. Engineers, police departments, city officials, state highway offices, and insurance investigators were all facing the same truth. A road system could not stay safe if every town invented its own meaning for paint, signs, and signals. The automobile had created a national problem, so the answer had to become national too. In 1927, highway officials produced a manual for rural roads. In 1929, safety leaders produced a manual for urban streets. Then, in 1935, the first manual on uniform traffic control devices brought those scattered ideas closer to one American rulebook. That change may sound bureaucratic, but it was revolutionary. A driver leaving Ohio, crossing into Indiana, and continuing toward Illinois, needed the road to speak the same language from one state to the next. A stop sign could not mean one thing in one county and something slightly different in another. A painted line could not whisper one instruction in daylight and betray a driver after dark. The early manuals turned pavement markings into a kind of public grammar. Lines could separate traffic, warn against passing, guide drivers around hills, and make dangerous curves easier to read. The road was becoming less dependent on memory and more dependent on visible instruction. For the first time, safety was being written directly onto the pavement in a form millions of strangers could understand. Then World War II changed the problem again. During blackout conditions, cities and towns had to think about traffic under darkness, dim light, and wartime restrictions. Materials had to be conserved, and visibility became more than a convenience. A line that looked clear in the afternoon could disappear at night, exactly when a tired driver needed it most. After the war, the country faced a new argument over color, contrast, and meaning. White, yellow, and even black markings had been used in different places, depending on pavement and local preference. What seemed practical to one state could confuse a driver from another. The question was no longer simply where to paint a line, but what that line should mean everywhere. The 1948 manual helped bring more order, but it also revealed how unfinished the system still was. Broken lines were used to show places where drivers could change lanes or pass, and a common pattern used a 15-foot stripe followed by a 25-foot gap. That spacing saved paint and gave the eye a rhythm to follow. But even then, America had not fully settled the language of the road. In 1954, another quiet improvement changed nighttime driving. Rural pavement markings used at night were required to become retroreflective, meaning they could return light from headlights back toward the driver. This mattered deeply on country highways, where there might be no street lamps, no buildings, and no second chance on a curve. The line was no longer just paint. It became a signal that could shine back through darkness. By 1961, the manual had grown more organized and more forceful. It was arranged into parts, chapters, and sections, closer to the structure used by the modern system. Federal aid highways were expected to follow its standards. That meant uniformity was no longer only a professional ideal. It was becoming tied to money, construction, and national accountability. The greatest visual shift came in the 1970s. The 1971 edition made yellow the color for separating traffic moving in opposite directions. White became the color for traffic moving in the same direction. In one decision, the road gained a color code that millions of Americans now read almost without thinking. Then the 1978 edition moved the system even closer to the road language drivers know today. Yellow was used as the centerline on two-way roadways, and the broken line pattern changed to a 10-foot stripe with a 30-foot gap. Every time a car passes one dashed segment and one open gap, it has traveled 40 feet. Most drivers never think about that distance, but their eyes and hands respond to it constantly. This was the modern transformation of the road line. It began as a simple attempt to keep cars from colliding on muddy or paved roads, but it became part of a national technology of trust. Paint, glass beads, manuals, federal rules, highway engineers, and night visibility all joined together. The result was a system so familiar that most Americans stopped seeing it, even though they depend on it every time they drive. The most powerful inventions are sometimes the ones that disappear into daily life. A driver sees a yellow line and does not think of committees, wartime blackouts, state highway poles, or decades of deadly confusion. He simply stays on his side. That is how a thin strip of color became one of the quiet machines holding modern America together. The final twist is that road lines did not simply organize traffic. They changed the relationship between strangers. Before the center line, a driver depended on judgment, courtesy, fear, and luck. After the center line, the road itself began to carry a promise. If you stay where the line tells you to stay, another person you will never meet may do the same. That promise is one of the quiet foundations of modern life. Every day, Americans pass vehicles moving in the opposite direction, with only a painted boundary between them. A truck may weigh thousands of pounds, a family car may carry children in the back seat, and both may be traveling fast enough to make one mistake unforgiving. Yet millions of drivers trust a strip of paint because the whole system has trained them to believe it means something. This is what makes the story larger than paint. A line on the road is not physically strong. It cannot stop a reckless driver, lift a vehicle out of danger, or repair a broken bridge. Its power comes from obedience, repetition, law, engineering, and shared belief. That shared belief took decades to build. First came scattered ideas in counties, cities, bridges, curves, and dangerous stretches of road. Then came manuals, standards, colors, night visibility, and federal guidance. What began as a local safety measure slowly became a national language. The color code Americans know today carries that history inside it. Yellow tells a driver that traffic on the other side is coming toward him. White tells him that nearby traffic is moving in the same direction. Most people read this instantly, not because they studied its origins, but because the lesson has been repeated through every mile they have ever driven. The dashed line is just as revealing. Since the late 1970s, the familiar broken lane line has followed a rhythm of 10 feet of paint and 30 feet of open space. That means one stripe and one gap equal 40 feet of travel. Most drivers imagine those markings as much shorter, which shows how the road quietly shapes perception without asking for attention. That is the genius of the system. It works best when nobody thinks about it. The driver does not have to remember Edward Hines, Dr. June McCarroll, Michigan road commissioners, California campaigns, or federal manuals. He only has to recognize the message beneath his tires and react before danger becomes visible. But the line also reveals something uncomfortable about progress. America could mass-produce cars before it could mass-produce road discipline. It could build engines, factories, dealerships, and highways before it had fully built the invisible agreement that made those highways safe. The country learned, painfully, that technology does not become civilization until rules catch up with power. That lesson still matters today. Modern vehicles now carry cameras, sensors, lane departure warnings, adaptive cruise control, and computer-assisted steering. But many of those systems still depend on the same old visual language painted on the pavement. Even the smartest car may look down and search for a line that began as one of the simplest ideas in road history. So the center line is not a relic from the past. It is a bridge between the first frightened drivers and the most advanced vehicles on the road today. It connects a milk wagon in Michigan, a Model T on a dusty road, a doctor forced aside in California, and a modern driver guided by dashboard alerts. The old paint is still teaching new machines how to understand the road, and that is the final turn in the story. The road line was created because human beings could not always trust one another at speed. Now, more than a century later, human beings are teaching machines to trust that same line. What began as a white mark to separate two frightened drivers has become one of the basic codes of movement in modern America. If this story made you look at the road a little differently, give this video a like. And if you remember the old roads, the first car you ever drove, or the way America used to feel before everything became automatic, share your memory in the comments. Subscribe for more forgotten stories about the small things that quietly changed everyday American life.